The number one determinant of whether someone is going to gain fat mass or lose fat mass is the energy that that person takes into their body via primarily carbs, fats, and proteins, and sometimes alcohol as well. However, adding a bit of complexity to this conversation around energy intake is a discussion around the microbiome and how that might actually affect the total amount of energy that a person takes into their body. So before I get to kind of explaining that, let me just take a step back and explain just the basics of the microbiome and the microbiota. Okay, so when I say microbiome, think genome. I'm talking specifically about the genetic material that we have in our body that's non-human because of all the different types of microbes like bacteria and viruses, mainly bacteria, that we have in and on our body, right? So because we have at least around 500 different species, I'm one species, we're the same species, you and I, okay? But within our body, we have around at least about 500 different species of gut bacteria. Because each of those different species have different genetic makeup, our total genetic makeup that's in and on our body is greatly expanded. That is the microbiome. Okay, and when I'm referring specifically to the organisms, so not their genetic material, but the organisms themselves, I'll use the term microbiota. And usually when I say that, I'm talking about bacteria. Okay, microbiota we have all over our body, on our body, in our body, and depending on the different species of microbiota, we are going to have a particular microbiome. Okay, so this is such an interesting area of research, and my goodness, there is just so much to know. We just do not know so much, and it's so hard to know because people are going to have different makeups, right? So if we have 500 different species, each person is going to have a different proportion of these varying species. And because of these differing proportions and differing microbiomes, there's a lot of differences that are going on in our gut. And because our gut speaks to our brain, communicates with the rest of the body, this is a really interesting area of research as far as how the microbiome impacts disease. And in our conversation, impacts obesity. Okay, but like it says here, there are still way more questions and answers. I always say, like, anyone that tells you that they know everything there is to know about the microbiota or microbiome, you need to run away because there's so much that we don't know and like we can't possibly know right now. Okay, so how does this have to do with obesity? So to be honest with you, a lot of this research has been done in animals, particularly mice, because they're just easier to study and easier to kind of manipulate and to kind of figure out what their microbiome is. We can breed mice in a way that they're germ-free, as in they don't have any bacterial populations, because we're technically born without that, although we get part of our bacterial populations through the vagina, through contact with our mother, through the contact with different people. But you can breed mice in a way that they are germ-free. And germ-free mice, they tend to have lower BMIs, even though they eat more calories than conventional mice, right? And some other evidence that the bacterial composition of the gut may have an impact on disease and obesity in particular is there have been studies that have taken feces from a donor, from a lean donor, for instance, and put it in an individual with obesity. And we see that when we take lean fecal matter and put it, exactly what it sounds like, and put it into individuals with obesity, sometimes, but depends on the study, we do see a reduction in BMI. Right? Just by transplanting, just by shifting the bacterial population of the colon. However, I have to say that the results aren't like black and white. Some studies have shown that, but on balance, it's really kind of hard to say what's going on and to even recommend fecal transplants for individuals with obesity. We're not there yet, and the results aren't strong enough to suggest that that's where we go. However, something's going on. Something's going on with the microbiota, the microbiome, that's affecting health and affecting propensity for obesity. So in order to understand this relationship, or what we believe is the relationship between the two, I have to take a step back and kind of go back to like first year nutrition and talk about fermentation of non-digestible carbohydrates by gut bacteria. Okay, so by the time that food, the remaining contents of food, enters the large intestine, which is mostly the colon, it's been like most of that food stuff has been digested, really broken down and absorbed, right? The majority of digestion, majority of absorption occurs in the small intestine. Now, what enters the large intestine, what enters the colon, is usually what we were not able to break down, what we were not able to digest. And if we can't digest it, we can't absorb it. Okay? The large intestine is kind of our last ditch effort. It's part of our last ditch effort to get more nutrients out of the food material that enters the large intestine. And the main way we do that is through the action of certain gut bacteria. Okay, so in this kind of simplistic diagram I have here, the kind of green parts here that represents fiber that is not digestible by human enzymes. Bacteria can act on certain fibers like fructooligosaccharides or cellulose or resistant starches. Certain bacteria can work on these indigestible carbohydrates and metabolize them in a way where we actually produce something called short chain fatty acids. This is actually our only source of short chain fatty acids in the diet, is from carbs, which is a strange thing to think of, right? From non-digestible carbohydrates, we can get short chain fatty acids based on the action of bacteria. These short chain fatty acids, they have varying effects. They can affect appetite. We'll talk about that later, but they can go into the bloodstream and contribute to total energy intake. Okay, so don't bother memorizing this diagram here, but this is just showing how certain bacteria can ferment non-digestible carbohydrates into different short chain fatty acids. And the main ones we see are propionate, acetate, and butyrate. So big picture is bacteria can help you get more basically calories out of the food you consumed. So what really provoked a lot of the research into this area and the effect of the microbiome on energy intake and propensity for obesity is the seminal paper from 2006 where Turnbaugh, hopefully I'm saying his name right, transplanted the microbiota of obese leptin deficient mice, small sample but nevertheless, into lean, germ-free, so they didn't have a bacterial population there, mice. Okay, so we're taking basically fecal matter, microbiota of obese mice and implanting it into lean mice. And what they actually found is that mice that were originally lean compared to those that were originally obese, they tended to have differing amounts of those short chain fatty acids, the one I just talked about on the last slide. They had differing amounts of those short chain fatty acids in their feces, basically showing that those obese mice produced more short chain fatty acids. So they were harvesting the energy out of those indigestible carbohydrates found in the feces more so. Okay. And they also found that the lean mice had more kilocalories, so more potential energy in their feces compared to obese mice. What does that mean? That those lean mice were excreting some of the potential energy that the obese mice were actually taking in. So the lean mice were actually taking in fewer calories. And then when we used germ-free mice and we implanted fecal matter from donors that were also lean, compared to donors that were obese, there was a significant difference in body weight increases, in percent of body weight increases. Okay, so germ-free mice, some germ-free mice, so they have no bacteria basically, okay, and then I give like microbiota contents from lean donors to these germ-free mice, compared to giving microbiota from obese mice. Those germ-free mice that were given fecal matter, that were given microbiota from obese mice, gained significantly more body weight, right? Compared to if they were receiving microbiota from these lean mice. Again, suggesting something's going on with the microbiota. Something's going on with the microbiome. That based on the particular population that the person has, that the individual has, in these case mice, there is a shift in the propensity for obesity in these mice. Okay, so the main proposed mechanism, or one of the two main proposed mechanisms on how a particular microbiome could increase risk of obesity is through an increase in energy harvesting, getting more calories out of your food, increasing energy intake, even with you not eating anymore. This is very frustrating. However, as we're going to see later in this course, another way that the microbiota could potentially impact propensity for obesity is through alterations in appetite, but we'll talk about that later, okay? Further adding some support to the potential that the microbiome and the particular populations you have in there can increase risk of obesity, there has been evidence that normal weight mice and individuals and humans have a different basically population of bacteria. So firmicutes and bacteroidetes, which are probably saying wrong, I never say them right. These are kind of account for the majority of the bacteria that, there are types of bacteria that are in our gut. Mice with obesity, right, and normal weight mice that are fed a high fat diet typically have a reduction in these bacteroidetes and higher percentage of these firmicutes. And what has been proposed is that firmicutes might be better at energy harvesting. They might be better at getting more energy out of the food that a person consumes. Okay? However, there's some debate about this, and it's hard. It's honestly, it's just such a difficult area to study. So it's not conclusive that that's the reason why, like, shifting the bacterial population is the reason why some people might be more likely for obesity than others. We do believe that energy harvesting is at least partly responsible for differences in body weight. But the exact mechanism and what we do about that, those remain very unclear. Okay, this just adds more support to the fact that there are complex physiological factors that kind of work together to promote obesity more so in some people than others. It doesn't give us a full picture, but it adds more to that particular argument.